Hello, everybody. Welcome to another installment of Be Your Own Boss, where you discuss a person's life and career and what got them to this point. Today, we have a very interesting guest, Stephen Chinnery, who has been a mentor and a good friend over 10 years. But before we get to that interview, hey, if you're getting value from this video, go ahead and hit the like button, and it really helps make people find this content. And if you're interested in hearing more people's experience of becoming their own boss, be sure to subscribe and tap the bell so you don't miss what's coming next. I've got a very insightful content on the way. All right, greetings, Stephen. As always, my guest, I like to get the guests to introduce themselves.
Well, good morning, David, and what a pleasure to be here. It's basically an honor. I've known you for a few years, and it's always been just a thrill to spend time with you and Michelle. This Be Your Own Boss is such a valuable tool, basically, out there because there's so many of us that were trapped in jobs, and it's just great to be able to be in charge and well, for example, we're doing this podcast in the middle of the day, and so when you're your own boss, you have control of your time, right? So, but thanks for letting me come on. Like I said, it's a real honor. And I never thought I'd be doing something like this in my 60s, but you were asking basically, I'm going to put my arm up here just to feel a bit more relaxed, but you were asking, I think, for me to just introduce myself. And as you can tell, I have a bit of an accent. And that's because I emigrated from England when I was actually a young boy and moved to Canada and spent several years in Canada, and that's all part of my story. Actually, is how I became my own boss. But ended up going to high school in Canada, going to university in Canada, joining the Canadian Air Force. Got to do some amazing things with the Air Force. You can probably see maybe you can't see my airplanes, but I've basically got drawn to aviation at a very young age, and that's been basically well, I'll tell you a little bit later on in the podcast how I made a bunch of money when I was younger, and eventually got a job like most of us do, working for the Boeing company, which is a big airplane company. And after working there for several years, just got that itch again. I'd owned my own business when I was younger. I had done lots of entrepreneurial things when I was younger, and we'll talk a little bit about that too, because I think it's part of the mindset, really, of becoming your own boss. After working at the job, the job, which I like to call the journey of the broke. If you don't have enough money, you got to go work for somebody else. And but after doing that for several years, we decided we need to start our own business again. And a big part of that was my wife, just like you, David. You have Michelle, who's they always say behind every successful man there's a strong woman, and you certainly have a strong woman in Michelle, and I do too. My wife Joan, and she supports me just as Michelle supports you, and pushes me to do better all the time. But yeah, I can talk a lot more about all the different things I've done. Basically, my name's Steve, and I'm your friend, and I'm David's friend. And
Well, let's go on to that journey from Canada. So what motivated you to go into aviation? What was that trigger? You said that you were motivated in aviation at a young age. What was that? What event?
it's a goofy story, actually. But when I was a little boy in England, well, she goes back years. When I was a baby, apparently, this is the story my mother told me, that when I was put in my pram, or perambulator, as they call those in England, I was pushed out in the pram, and my mother would put me outside. Yeah, like a baby carriage. And a perambulator is the proper English word, David. Come on.
Okay. All right. You've just enlightened us. So
Yeah.
continue.
So, and but anyway, I used to apparently be put outside for my compulsory fresh air every day. And when the airplanes used to fly over my house, my parents used to watch me, and I used to try and grab at the airplanes with my hand. And my mother made the comment to my dad years ago, our son's going to be a pilot. And this was when I was, 6 months old or something like that, or 7 months old. It was crazy. But I don't know whether my mother sowed the seed in me or what it was. But we moved to Canada when I was 13. My father was relocated with his company from the UK to Canada. And he wasn't in aviation. He was an engineer. My mother was a teacher. Went to high school. One day I decided, I really want to pursue getting a pilot's license. It's expensive, to get a pilot's license is expensive. And I had no flipping idea how I was going to do it. So I started working jobs, and say I was delivering newspapers back in the days when newspapers existed, making money and saving money. And my dad used to say, "What are you saving for, son?" I said, "I'm going to take a flying lesson." And he goes, "That's a lot of money." And I said, "Well, I was motivated to do it." And I think that's the key to being your own boss, David, is
Motivation.
you've got to set a goal and you've got to be willing to work for it, even if it takes years. And then a crazy story. I was walking to school one day and I saw a sign on a telephone pole and it said, "You want to be a pilot? Join the Air Cadets." Well, the Air Cadets is very akin in America to the Civil Air Patrol. And I went to this meeting at a local high school the following evening, and there was a chubby man at the front of the wearing a uniform, and there was kids dressed up in sort of Air Cadet type uniforms, and like the Civil Air Patrol, if you're familiar with that, it's a Civil Air Patrol is an auxiliary of the United States Air Force.
Well, I think in the US we call it ROTC. I was actually
It's actually called Civil Air Patrol in the States. And in fact, the Civil Air Patrol was big in the Second World War. They used to patrol the Delaware coast and
mm,
actually sank one submarine with light aircraft and small aircraft. So the history of the Civil Air Patrol is a whole another that's another podcast for you. And but anyway, I went to this meeting and this chubby guy at the front of the room said, "Hey, if you want to get your pilot's license, sign up." So I went to him after the meeting and I said, "Can I really get my pilot's license?" And he said, "Yeah." I said, "Well, what do I have to do?" And he said, "Well, young man, the first thing you should do is cut your hair." And I had long hair like we all did back in it seems funny to talk about hair now, David, since none of us have any.
mhm,
But
yeah.
so I did. That next day I went out and cut all my hair off and I made a decision. And I joined the Air Cadets. And at the age of 15, I got my glider pilot's license. And I learned to fly gliders and, through the Air Cadets. My license number was YZG 1071. I was the 1071st glider pilot in Canada. So that was exciting. And then the following year, when I turned 16, I was eligible to get my private pilot's license. And I was sent to Canadian Forces Base North Bay up in Northern Ontario and spent 6 weeks up there getting my private pilot's license. And well, that gave me the bug. I was totally into flying. And it gave me the bug as well to want to join the military, quite frankly. And I wanted to become a fighter pilot. I wanted to fly jets. I wanted to fly fast and go zoom, zoom through the sky. And so after high school, I enrolled in the Royal Military College of Canada, which is a bit akin to West Point or United States Air Force Academy or the Naval Academy or something like that, and spent my 4 years there. But interestingly, and this is kind of a twist on the whole thing, I went there to be a pilot and to fly. But getting into the military college was very competitive, and you had to be obviously focused on passing all their tests and physical fitness and academics and having good grades and yada yada yada. And so I did all that, but the recruiter had told me, he said, "Hey, what you need to do is go into the Navy. If you tell them you want to be in the Canadian Navy. Nobody wants to be in the Canadian Navy." He says, "Just tell them you want to be in the Canadian Navy and they'll accept you into the military college. And when you get there, you can just
Switch.
switch." Okay. And as a naive 18-year-old, or 17-year-old, I signed the forms. I want to be a naval officer. And so off I went to military academy. And guess what they did? They sent me for Navy training. And every year after my summer training, I would write them a letter saying, I enjoyed my training, thank you very much, but I want to be an Air Force pilot. And I would get back these nice letters from the Department of National Defense and say, Cadet Chinnery is obviously well suited to the naval environment. He can look forward to a long career. Yeah, so it was kind of ridiculous. My whole
So
concept of
you think the recruiter was kinda like trying to
not,
get you in?
oh, he was lying. It's like all recruiters do. Sorry, that should be an aside. But
We could edit that out if you want.
no, it's the truth. So I'm going to tell the truth, David. And anyway, so the people at the college says, "You really want to get in the Air Force, Steve, you've got to do well at your Navy training." Well, it was a kind of a paradox because the Air Force wouldn't take me if I didn't do well. But if I did well, the Navy didn't want to let me go. And so it was the goofiest thing. Anyway, I graduated as a navigating officer on a destroyer, quite honestly. And and so I served on HMCS Capel, which was the fastest destroyer at the time on the West Coast. And we had a big parade one day, and I was the parade commander, and I had the sword of honor and the whole bit, and I was marching around. And right after the parade was over, I marched into the admiral's office and said, "Hey, I really don't want to be in the Navy." And he said, "But you're doing so well. You have the sword of honor." I said, "Yeah, I get all that." I said, "But I have a girlfriend. I want to get married, and the Navy is not the life for me. I want to be in the Air Force." And you know what? He literally picked up the phone. He called the Department of National Defense and said, "Transfer this kid to the Air Force." And it was that fast.
You think it was your conviction that
Yes.
that
Absolutely, it was. It was the honesty, it was the speaking the truth, no BS, just and the conviction of what I wanted, which, is ultimately been sort of my mantra in terms of being successful in business later on. You have to know what you want to do. You've got to, write it down. I mean, all these self-help coaches and say, write down your goals. Where do you see yourself in 5 years? Where do you see yourself in 10 years? And I knew back then I wanted to be married. I wanted to be married to my wife Joan, and
right?
being in the
Yeah.
Navy was not conducive to that.
Well, did you write those down? Because sometimes I feel like when the self-help books and stuff say that, people just write it down and think that that's going to be enough. And I think they missed somebody, always missed the point. It says it's almost got to be ingrained in your either your heart or your head before you even put it on paper. I mean, you could put it on paper for edification and just for something that you have physically, but if it's not ingrained in you, it doesn't work.
Well, that's exactly right, and you can artificially ingrain stuff, like you could say, "I wanna have," your goals have to be SMART goals, right? And you've all heard that on all the podcasts, it's gotta be specific and measurable and attainable and realistic and yada, 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 SMART
Timely,
goals.
right?
And yeah, you can write down, "Hey, by December 31st, I wanna have, $100,000 extra in my bank account." That's very specific and measurable. Yeah, yeah, yeah. But I think in my case, I was more motivated, not necessarily by having written it down, but I knew I wanted to be married to my wife, Joan, or to my girlfriend, Joan. And that was so deep in my soul that I was going to do
Exactly.
anything to do that.
Right. And that's where the disconnection becomes is because if it's just written down and you don't do anything about it, or if it's really not, you're not, it's like we talked about truth. If you're not really true to yourself, then you're basically lying to yourself, right?
Yeah,
Those
absolutely.
words, truth and lying to yourself is as much real as it is you and me talking about either truth or not telling the truth.
Yeah, you're absolutely right, David. I mean, whatever you think about and talk about, your brain hears through these two ears, and you've got two ears and one mouth, and it's hearing twice as much as you're saying. So you can say all these things, but you've got to believe it. And if you don't believe stuff, and Napoleon Hill said many years ago in his famous book, whatever the mind of man can conceive
Believe.
and believe, it will
Yeah,
achieve.
key, believe,
You've
right.
got to believe it, and the thing about belief is you have to choose to believe.
Yes.
It's a choice, right? You can't
Yep.
you can't just say, "I believe, I believe, I believe," and repeat it 150 times, so, you know, you have to choose to believe it. You have to choose to believe that you're gonna be successful. You have to choose to believe you're gonna get in the Air Force. You have to anyway, so let me tell you my crazy story because it gets even better. So I eventually get into the Air Force, but, whilst I was doing all that, I had actually run my first company, which I don't even know if you know this, David, but, I needed a bunch of extra money while I was dating my girlfriend Joan, and everybody knows that dating girls is expensive, and I was still at college, and I needed to make some money. And when you're at college, you don't make a lot of money unless you go work at a pizza shop. But this is back in the '70s. There wasn't a lot of jobs to do, and frankly, being in a military academy, there wasn't a lot of opportunities to go get a job. You couldn't just like take your uniform off and walk into town and go work at the pizza shop. It didn't work that way. So I started. I was really into stereos. Now most kids these days don't know what a stereo is. Back in the old days, we had things called loudspeakers, and you had a receiver, or you had an amplifier, and you had a preamp, and you had a turntable, and
Tell
you
me
put these
about it.
big
I still have some of that equipment,
yeah, and you put these discs on this thing called a turntable, and you spin them around, and you stick a
right.
needle on them, and the needle stop.
I think you're right, it's coming back. I know a lot of folks are still going back to the vinyls.
Exactly, but it was a big thing back in the '70s, and we used and And so everybody was always looking for a deal on stereo equipment, you know. And I found a company in the States, which isn't in business anymore, called Stereo Discounters. And I basically rented a truck and drove to the United States on my weekends and would pick up equipment from this company called Stereo Discounters that have been shipped to me into, I don't even remember where the town was now. It was just north of Watertown, New York, but I used to cross the border and go pick up stuff. And eventually the company set me up with a business account and they started shipping stuff to Canada. And I would just go to the customs office in Kingston, Ontario, and I would get to pick up all this stereo equipment. Well, the customs lady got so confused by what I was doing. She goes, "You work at the military college, right?" I said, "No, I don't work there. I'm a student." She goes, "Well, what is all these boxes of, turntables and loudspeakers and all this stereo equipment?" I said, "Oh, I run a business out of the college. I sell stereo equipment." And she goes, "Could you get me some?" And I said, "You bet I could." So I set the head customs lady up with all this stereo equipment. Well, guess what? After that, she started waiving all the duty on the stuff I was bringing in. So instead of charging me the standard 10%, she would like charge me 2% or something like that. Well, guess what? That just up my profit. And I would say by the time I left the college, I would say probably 50% of the college people at the college have bought their stereo equipment from Steve Chinnery. And now, did I save any of that money? Absolutely not. Joan
No,
and I just went
Jesus.
out for dinner and we just spent it. We had a great time. And I got into trouble a couple of times because people would be lining up at my dorm door to place their orders and things like that. And so I used to be called Mr. Stereo. Well, I got I got the sort of bug in that sense of running a business, and I love to fly, and I have my private pilot's license, and I decided I wanted to get my commercial pilot's license, and so I actually took some of the money from the stereo business, and I started taking additional flying lessons in order to qualify for my commercial pilot's license. So once I had that set up, while I was still in college, actually, I started a small airline, and it was called Chinair, and our slogan was "Chin Air flies anywhere." And in southern Ontario, there's not very many places to get around. You have to drive Highway 401 to go east and west, and heading north is tough because there are just no roads heading north. And so we set up a small airline, and I hired a couple of other pilots, and we leased airplanes, small airplanes, small Cessnas, small Pipers, and things like that. And we ran a commuting operation. Essentially, we first got started running medical packages around we were kind of like a mini FedEx. And people would say, hey, now can you fly this medical package up to Ottawa General Hospital? And we'd fly up to Ottawa because we could do that flight in an hour, whereas it would take a truck 3-4 hours to drive up.
Mm,
And it was a blood
okay.
sample or something like that.
Mhm.
So we contracted with the local hospital and we flew medical packages to Ottawa. We flew medical packages to North Bay, to Sudbury. And then we eventually branched out into taking passengers because kids could fly with us from, say, Kingston. And Kingston is a big university town and Queen's University was there. And a lot of kids came from Northern Ontario. Well, to drive to Northern Ontario, you'd have to drive 3.5 hours west to Kingston, from Kingston to Toronto, and then you'd have to drive 6-7 hours north
North.
of Toronto to get up to Sudbury. And I could do that flight about 2.25 hours.
Wow.
So for kids, it was like, hey, we can pay this guy Steve in Chin Air to fly us up there and get us home in 2.25 hours, or we can sit on a bus or drive for 10 hours. And so that became super lucrative. We basically almost every weekend
Had a full flight?
we had several flights going all the time.
Wow.
So I had hired a bunch of guys at the academy who have pilots licenses, and everybody was interested in just building their hours. So that was a big deal, And they even at lunchtime over announcements they used to say Chinair's got flights going to North Bay or Sudbury this weekend. And so it was like, what is this? Chinnery's a military officer. He's trying to become a Air Force officer, and he's running a flipping airline and a stereo company at the same time.
But
But
you're doing this both at the same time?
yeah, because I used my stereo money to help pay for someone pay the pilots and things like that. So,
Wow.
but anyway, it was a pretty good gig, and we ran that for about 2 years. But it gave me the bug, David. It gave me the bug that I loved being in charge, and I loved running things for myself. So, long story short, got out of the Navy, got into the Air Force, and and did my gig in the Air Force, and got to fly some pretty cool planes. Somebody asked me on Facebook the other day, "What's the fastest speed you've ever gone?" And people were writing down, "Oh, I did 140 miles an hour in my car." One guy says, "Oh, I did 200 in my Porsche," and things like that. So I came in big balls, David, and just said, "I did Mach 2.1 on an F-104."
The quick hits?
Nothing happened. Nobody responded to that. There's not much you can say. The CF-104 was the derivative of the F-104. It was called the Starfighter. Yeah, I took that thing to Mach 2.1. And, I think it's
What
top.
altitude would you got at that? Is that like 10 to
Oh
20?
no, we were probably. I forget now, David. Those years ago. Probably 20,000 feet, something like that. Maybe even higher. That thing could do 50,000 feet if it wanted to, because it was essentially it was a fighter bomber, right? But let's not digress and start talking about
No, no,
airplanes.
no, no.
You and I could talk about airplanes all day
No,
long.
that's fine. And how much time did you have to spend in the military after you got out of the academy? Was that
I did
a
10
full
years.
service or full 4 years or something?
No, because what happened was my wife Joan had also gotten into the Air Force, and we were fortunate. We went to high school together. We went to college together. She didn't go to the military academy because girls weren't allowed there. She went to Queen's University, which was in the same town. So we've always spent time together. And then when we got stationed together in a place called Cold Lake, Canada. Cold Lake was the most northerly fighter base in Canada. It's where they intercept all the Ruskies and things like that. And it was a great place to start a marriage because there was nothing there. And Cold Lake was aptly named, by the way.
Yeah.
It was
Yep.
definitely cold up there. And we had the Primrose Lake Air Weapons Range there, where we used to drop bombs and shoot rockets and things like that. It was cool. It was a cool place to fly and be in the Air Force. But after being there a few years, they told me that I was going to get posted to Ottawa and Joan was going to get posted to Nova Scotia. And because back in those days, they didn't care whether you were married. These days especially in the U.S. Air Force,
They try to.
they try to keep married couples together, but in those days they didn't care. You just belonged to the military, and they sent you wherever they wanted you. And so they told me I was going to go to Ottawa, and Joan was going to go to Shearwater, and so I punched out, um, that's an interesting story in itself. If you don't mind me just telling stories, David, is that
Go
okay?
right ahead. Yeah.
So we were always trying to find ways of staying together, and so I came off flying duties and went back to school in the Air Force to become a EOD officer, which I don't know if your viewers know what EOD is. It's explosive ordnance disposal. And it's the guys that blow up bombs and diffuse bombs and things like that. And it's normally done by enlisted people, but every now and again they have a space where they need an officer to do it. So I went to training as a EOD officer. And part of the reason to do that was Joan was taking a computer course, coincidentally in Kingston, Ontario. And so I got to go see her at weekends. We were still separated, but I got to see her. I had weekends off from the training. Well, one of those weekends, there was an ad in the newspaper, and it was an ad for an open house put on by the Boeing company. Well, in Canada, an open house means free food and beer. So Joan said to me, she says, "Why don't you stop at that open house on your way back to your course on Sunday night? Because Boeing's having this open house, and you can get some dinner and a drink." I went, "Okay." So I rolled into this hotel in Toronto back in 1985, and there was this sign saying "open house." And I went, "Right." So off I went to get my free food and beer, and I walk in. There's no food, there's no beer. In fact, there's nothing. Just a guy sitting at a desk, and he says, "Can I help you?" And I went, "Yeah, I'm here for the open house." He goes, "Do you have a resume?" I go, "A what?" He goes, "A resume." He says, "This is like a job fair." I went, "No, this is open house, man." I said, "This is free food and beer." He says, "No, it's a job fair." He said, "Do you want a job?" I went, I hadn't really thought about it. I said, "But sure, what do you got?" So he says, "Here, go up this hallway to this room, and there's a guy in there called Hans McGiso. He'll interview you." You should have brought a resume. And I said, "Well, I was looking more for the food and beer than a job." So I went and saw this guy, Hans McGiso, and he and I chatted for, I don't know, an hour or so. And this is a key point I wanted to make, because at the end of the interview, this guy, Hans McGiso, told me, he said, "Steve, it's been a pleasure talking to you." He said, "But you have absolutely no experience or qualifications that the Boeing company is interested in." And I went, "Okay, no problem. You didn't have any beer or food anyway, so we're we're even. But then he said to me, he says, but I really like you. He said, I like your attitude. He said, I like your can-do attitude. I love the things that you've been doing. He said, I'm going to keep you in mind. And believe it or not, about 6 months later, I was sitting in my hangar back in Cold Lake, and the phone rang, and this man called Bill Gallivan rang me up, and he said, hey, my name's Bill Gallivan. I'm from the Boeing Company. He says, would you like to do an interview? Because Hans Meguso says you're a really cool guy. And it stuck in my mind that it's not what you know, it's not who you know, but it's how you make people feel. And I impressed Hans Megiso. I made him feel good. He liked me. I liked him. And bubba ding, bubba doom, I got offered a job at the Boeing Company.
Man,
Well, it
I
gets
mean,
even better because I went to my boss and I told my boss, I said, hey, I just got offered a job by the Boeing Company. And my boss said, well, that's really sad, isn't it? He says, because you're going to Ottawa. And I said, well, I said, I don't really want to go to Ottawa. I'd rather go to Philadelphia to go work for the Boeing Company. And he goes, well, you have to give 6 months notice. So I called back to Boeing and I said, hey, I have to give 6 months notice to get out of the military. Could you hold the job for 6 months? And they said, not a chance. And so I said, okay, all right. So I went back to my boss and I said, apparently they told me, Major Shaver, they would hold it for 2 months. And he goes, well, you're out of luck then, son. I said, would you mind if I go talk to the colonel about that, which is the commanding officer, right? He goes, I don't care if you go talk to the man on the moon. He says, you ain't getting out. So I felt pretty sad, but I went home and told Joan about it. We were married at the time, and she said, you go talk to the colonel. She says, you've always been really good at persuading people, and she says, you're focused. She says, the colonel is going to help you out. And she's kind of spoke that into existence, right? And there's a lot of power in speaking what you want. And so I went and saw the colonel the next day and saw his secretary and stood there and saluted. And the secretary said, so, Captain Chinnery, I hear you're going to quit. And I was like,
so he's
well,
already been notified.
yeah, So I knocked on the colonel's door, and he says, enter. And I walked in. He goes, Chinnery, I don't like quitters. I went, no, sir, I know that. I said, but it is a great opportunity. And he goes, well, what is this great opportunity you think you've got? Major Shaver says you just want to quit. Anyway, he basically, he listened, and I said to him, hey, I'm down in Philadelphia working at Boeing Vertol. And he said, hey, stop right there. He said, did you say Boeing Vertol? And I said, yes. He says, well, Major Shaver didn't tell me that. I said, does that make a difference? He says, well, when Canada bought their Chinooks, he says, I was the chief test pilot. He said, I spent two years in Philadelphia. That would be a great place to work. And he picked up the phone, and just like the admiral in the Navy, this guy called Ottawa. And 2 weeks later, I was out of the military and I was working in Philadelphia. So there's a lot of power to be said, speaking what you want, just believing in your heart what you want and where you want to go. And so I did a decent career at Boeing. And then just to wrap up the story, I was trying to improve myself at Boeing and become the best engineer and the best this and the best that, and read lots of books on all this. Everybody reads all the self-help books, Magic of Thinking Big and Think and Grow Rich and all the how to win friends and influence people. And I was always trying to improve myself that way. And I think that's a key when you want to be your own boss. You've got to do some preparation. And if you don't have experience working with people, that's get some. Because when you run your own business, you're working with people. You've got to have customers, you've got to have clients, you've got to have patients. Whatever your business is going to be, you've got to have people, and so you got to get good at working with people. And eventually, I ran into a group called the Worldwide Group, which was a group of professional people that help people start businesses and ran events and podcasts and put out training videos and things like that. And Joe and I ended up starting our own network marketing business while we were working at Boeing, and got quite successful at that. So, selling all sorts of different products, whatever was, if hula hoops were in, we sold hula hoops. If energy drinks were the thing, we sold energy drinks. If makeup was the thing, we sold makeup. If vitamins was the thing, whatever it was, we diversified into so many different things. We even worked with Visa cards at one point, and Best Buy and all sorts of companies like that. And ultimately, when I turned 55, Boeing did a massive layoff. And laid off all the senior people. That seems to be a sign of the times these days. Big companies are always, quote, re-engineering or reshuffling their people. I got laid off at age 55, but fortunately we had a network marketing business and we've never looked back since. That's pretty much what we do. My wife had worked a job for a while and she quit as well and stayed home with the kids, stayed home with me. And thank you, David, for inviting us on, because we have a very successful network marketing business now. We work with people in multiple different states, different countries, and I get to work from home. I get to meet great people like you and Michelle, and it's been a great ride. And I'm in my 60s now, and I've been like I said, I was laid off from my job at age 55. I can't believe it's been
10 years
11
or
years. I'll be
11
67
years.
this year, so 12 years, and life has been so good. And do I miss the flying? Yeah, I miss the flying. But I keep telling Joan I'm going to buy an airplane. When my favorite plane is a biplane, is a Stearman, and I said there's plenty of them around in Delaware to buy, and I said I'm going to buy myself a Stearman. And she says, "Well, you keep speaking it, and you probably will." So, you know. But anyway, does that help? That was a long introduction, but that's
No, no, no. I mean, this is great. I mean, you're touching on the relationship angle of this, and it's always business or entrepreneur starts with relationships. I mean, it's you have to go back in history to bartering, trading before we had coins and dollar bills. You bartered, right? You bartered for this or that, and it's kind of, but you have to have a relationship because you don't want to be, you want to get the value that you need out of the product that you're selling. And the only way to do that is to have a very good relationship with the people you meet, because you just don't know who that person is.
no, and I'll go back to that thing I said a few minutes ago. It's how people, people don't remember what you say or what you do. They just remember how you make them feel. And you've always got to be respectful. And then these days, with the country being so divided, sometimes it's hard to be, respectful, or But I've got people on. I work with people on all sides of the spectrum, because I don't care whether people are, I don't care what color they are, what creed they are, what their beliefs are, whether they're Democrat, Republican, or Libertarian, or whatever they are. All I care about is whether you have an ambition and do you want to buy some products, you know. So
Exactly. I mean, but that's always difficult. I think there's just this, um, you know, people are at different places in their lives. I think a lot of people don't understand that. It's like you can't have two truths to be true at the same time. Yes, you can. You could be hopeful and fearful at the same time, but
for sure.
you gotta overcome it. And so it's been a pleasure talking with Stephen. It's always a pleasure talking with you. It's we're I guess, is there any final comments before I, kind of wrap this up, or do you have anything else you'd like to kind of point out? Or
I guess the mantra, which I've always, is what I call the ABC from Napoleon Hill. Whatever the mind of man whatever your mind of your man can conceive, the see, and believe, you can achieve. But it's that belief part. I think the belief part is the toughest part. You can come up with some scary ideas and say, oh, I want to do this, I want to do that. But until you really believe in your heart of hearts, or your mind of minds, and you're willing to speak it, maybe write it down. In the good book it says, write it down clearly on tablets of stone, and then read it. Good Lord, read it every day. But I think that also, I'm not saying this to put off single guys, but if you have a wife, or a serious partner, you got to make sure you're both on the same page. Because you can conceive of all the great ideas, but unless you have somebody who's going to back you up and support you, they can be undermining you at every.
well, I mean, you mentioned it earlier on, right? The relationships with your spouse is critical to how do you treat everybody else, right? If you're
Good
not
place
good
to
with
practice.
relationships, you're not going to be good with your relationships in business, because one or
Exactly.
the other is going to impact the other.
Now that doesn't mean that you can't be successful if you're single, you know, and
True.
and take a look at Elon Musk. I don't support his relationships at all. He's got he's had hundreds of wives and girlfriends and things like that. I don't agree with any of that. But you know what? Every one of those partners or girlfriends that he had were very supportive of what he was doing, and so, there is still that key. So if you're single, whether you're married, whether you're in a relationship or not, it all comes back to belief, David. If you don't believe, ain't
Well,
nothing.
but and the belief is the whether or not you choose to believe, right? And
Absolutely.
some people
Absolutely.
don't want to choose, and you can't make them choose, and you can't make them, buy your products because no matter if you're emotional about it, I mean, it's if they've already chose not to, and
Yeah.
they go to that comes back to me always as value, right? If the value is not present, then they're just looking for a cheap alternative that may not be good for them. They chose that. It can't, you can't change their mind about it.
Yeah. No, you're absolutely right. But
But
anyway, I could channel day to you. I just enjoy spending time with you. You're one of the
I appreciate it, and I may invite you back for some other stories. Who knows? It's been a good talk, and I appreciate it. And everybody that's online, thanks for joining us, and we'll conclude that for now. And look forward to everybody join us again for my next podcast. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much.